I went to pick up my son from my mother's house, and he was calling her mommy. I recorded her saying, "He'd better get used to it. You'll lose custody soon." There were attorney papers on the table. The sound of the word mommy coming from my 5-year-old son's mouth directed at my mother, Regina, as he ran into her arms as if I weren't standing there at the living room door watching that impossible scene, was the first sign that something was terribly wrong on that rainy Thursday afternoon when I arrived 20 minutes earlier, then agreed to pick up Fernando from her house after my shift at the office, where I'd worked as a financial analyst for 12 years, building a solid career that allowed me to offer a comfortable life to my son as a single mother. Ever since Marcos and I separated amicably when Fernando was just 2 years old, my 37 years of carefully organized existence, built on foundations of dedicated work, responsible motherhood, and especially on the comforting conviction that I perfectly knew all the important people in my life, especially my own mother who regularly helped by watching Fernando 3 times a week while I worked, crumbled instantly when I noticed the triumphant smile on Regina's lips as she watched my shocked reaction to that word that should have been exclusively mine, but was now being naturally offered by my young son. To the person who had clearly taught him to make that devastating exchange of maternal identity through weeks or possibly months of calculated psychological manipulation during the hours I trusted my most precious treasure to her care, the sensation of absolute betrayal mixed with maternal panic created a toxic cocktail of emotions flooding my nervous system, demanding immediate action to protect my child from whatever sinister plan was unfolding before my disbelieving eyes, while my analytical mind, trained through years of financial work, desperately tried to process the implications of that impossible scene unfolding in real time as Regina maintained that triumphant smile that revealed so much about intentions I had been completely blind to until that exact devastating moment when layers of maternal pretense fell away, exposing the manipulative monster hiding beneath the mask of caring grandmother I had foolishly believed was genuine during all those months, trustingly delivering Fernando into her arms 3 times weekly while working to provide the comfortable middle-class life that apparently wasn't good enough for her impossibly high standards about appropriate environments. For raising her grandson according to criteria, she had obviously decided unilaterally, without bothering to discuss with me as his actual legal mother, possessing all parental rights over decisions affecting his upbringing, education, healthcare, and especially over the fundamental identity, defining question of who deserved the sacred title of mommy that Regina had apparently decided she could simply appropriate through systematic brainwashing of an innocent 5-year-old child too young to understand he was being used as an instrument in a power struggle I hadn't even known existed until 20 minutes ago when I made the fateful decision to leave work. Early finishing the quarterly report ahead of deadline, earning praise from my supervisor about dedication and efficiency that now felt completely meaningless compared to the catastrophic discovery of maternal betrayal unfolding as Fernando continued clinging to Regina's legs, calling her mama repeatedly, as if testing the word or perhaps showing off his newly learned vocabulary for her benefit, while completely oblivious to the devastation each repetition was causing in my shattered heart. The recording I had instinctively started on my phone captured not just Fernando's innocent words, but also Regina's chilling response. When she finally acknowledged my presence with a cold stare that held none of the maternal warmth I had known throughout my 37 years as her daughter, saying in a voice dripping with calculated cruelty that he had better get used to calling her mommy, because I would be losing custody very soon according to the attorney whose papers were conveniently visible on the coffee table, positioned strategically, where I couldn't miss them upon entering the living room, confirmed that this wasn't some innocent confusion or harmless game, but rather a deliberate, calculated attack on my parental rights, orchestrated meticulously over months. While I had been working to support my son, believing my mother was providing loving care, when she was actually implementing a systematic campaign to replace me in his affections, and apparently in his legal custody as well, based on whatever lies she had told some attorney willing to take money to help a grandmother steal a child from his fit and loving mother, for reasons I couldn't begin to comprehend, even as my analytical mind raced through possibilities ranging from control issues to mental health deterioration to simple malicious cruelty as revenge for perceived slights I wasn't aware of committing. During what I had believed was a positive relationship between mother and daughter characterized by mutual respect, and especially by shared commitment to Fernando's well-being, that now revealed itself to have been completely one-sided, with me being the only one genuinely committed to healthy family dynamics, while Regina had apparently been nursing grievances and plotting this betrayal for months or possibly years, waiting for the perfect moment to strike with maximum devastating impact that she achieved perfectly by ensuring I would discover the plot accidentally rather than being informed, directly giving her sadistic pleasure from watching my shocked reaction. As the full horror of the situation crystallized in my mind within those first 30 seconds of standing frozen in that doorway, holding my phone steadily enough to capture clear video evidence despite hands shaking with adrenaline and rage flooding my system demanding immediate confrontation that my more rational mind thankfully overruled, recognizing that documented proof would be far more valuable in the legal battles obviously coming than any emotional satisfaction from screaming accusations that Regina could easily deny later without corroborating evidence. I forced my voice to remain calm, asking Fernando in the most normal tone I could manage despite wanting to cry or scream, or both simultaneously, to get his backpack, because it was time to go home to our apartment where we lived together as mother and son, in what I had foolishly believed was a secure and happy arrangement that obviously Regina had decided was inadequate, according to standards she had apparently been judging me against silently during all those pleasant conversations we had shared over coffee while Fernando played nearby. Conversations I had enjoyed, believing we were bonding as grandmother and mother, cooperating to raise a happy, healthy child when she had actually been gathering ammunition for this custody battle. She had planned so meticulously that attorney papers were already drawn up ready to file in court, seeking to legally steal my son based on what accusations I couldn't imagine, since I had always been a devoted, responsible mother providing appropriate care on a modest but sufficient budget that prioritized Fernando's needs over my own wants consistently throughout his 5 years of life. Attending every pediatric appointment, documenting his health carefully, participating actively in school activities demonstrating investment in his education, and maintaining daily routines ensuring adequate nutrition, sufficient sleep, and emotional security through consistent, loving presence. That Regina had apparently decided to characterize as inadequate parenting worthy of having custody transferred to her, despite her being 63 years old, and therefore presumably less energetic than a 37-year-old mother in her prime parenting years. Despite her having already raised her children, including me, with results that clearly included producing someone willing to betray her own daughter, so cruelly suggesting questionable success in instilling values of loyalty and family bonds. And despite most fundamentally the fact that Fernando was my son, not hers, giving me primary parental rights that could only be terminated. Under extreme circumstances involving abuse or neglect that simply didn't exist in our situation, no matter how Regina tried to twist reality through whatever lies she had told that attorney, the short drive home to our modest 2-bedroom apartment in a safe middle-class neighborhood that I had chosen, carefully prioritizing good schools and low crime rates over trendy amenities that would have cost more than my carefully managed budget could accommodate, while still saving for Fernando's future college education through small but consistent monthly contributions to his educational fund, was accomplished on autopilot while my conscious mind raced through implications of Regina's betrayal, trying to understand motivations for such an extreme action against her own daughter, who had never been anything but respectful and appreciative of the help she provided watching Fernando regularly, always thanking her sincerely and frequently, bringing small gifts showing gratitude for her time and effort with her grandson, never presuming upon her generosity or demanding more help than she offered voluntarily, and especially never criticizing her methods of caring for Fernando during those supervised hours. Because I had trusted completely that her love for her grandson would naturally align with his best interests, ensuring appropriate care that honored my parental authority over major decisions while allowing her grandmother latitude over minor choices during their time together. Trust that now revealed itself to have been catastrophically misplaced, as Regina had apparently been using those unsupervised hours to systematically undermine my maternal authority, teaching Fernando to call her mommy as part of a calculated campaign to confuse his understanding of family roles, making him more receptive to the idea of living with her permanently if her custody suit somehow succeeded in convincing a judge that I was an inadequate mother despite all evidence to the contrary, including my spotless record of responsible parenting throughout Fernando's entire life, my stable employment providing consistent income supporting our modest but comfortable lifestyle, my involvement in his education and healthcare documented meticulously through years of careful record. Keeping that was my habit as a financial analyst trained to maintain detailed documentation of all important decisions and outcomes, and especially the obviously strong, loving bond between Fernando and me that anyone with eyes could see during our daily interactions, characterized by affection, respect, and healthy attachment that Regina was now trying to damage through her manipulations, teaching him to redirect primary maternal attachment toward her, instead of appropriately maintaining the grandmother-grandson relationship that should have been secondary to his mother. Son bond with me as his primary caregiver throughout his 5 years of life since Marcos and I separated amicably, agreeing that Fernando would live primarily with me while maintaining regular contact with his father. Who would be absolutely horrified when I told him about Regina's betrayal, since Marcos, despite our divorce, had always been respectful of my parenting and especially appreciative of Regina's help watching Fernando. Never imagining that her assistance masked ulterior motives to eventually replace me entirely in our son's life, through this insane custody battle that seemed to come from nowhere, but had obviously been planned meticulously over months, while I worked trustingly unaware that my mother was systematically betraying me in the worst way possible by targeting my relationship with my child. The evening routine that I implemented with shaking hands trying to maintain normalcy for Fernando's sake despite wanting to collapse under the weight of maternal terror about losing custody, and especially about the psychological damage Regina had already inflicted teaching him to call her mommy, confusing his understanding of maternal identity during critical developmental years when secure attachment to primary caregiver was essential for healthy emotional development, according to all the parenting books I had read conscientiously, trying to be the best mother possible despite limited financial resources. Compared to Regina's substantial wealth accumulated during decades of successful professional career, and especially through family inheritance that she had mentioned occasionally when discussing financial planning, included preparing Fernando's favorite dinner of chicken nuggets with vegetables that he actually ate without complaint, thanks to the creative presentation tricks I had learned over years of patient effort, making nutrition fun rather than a battle, bath time with extra bubbles and his favorite rubber duck toys, and bedtime story routine reading 3 books per night that had been our special bonding time. Ever since he was an infant, when I discovered that hearing my voice telling stories calmed him immediately, no matter how fussy he had been moments before, all accomplished mechanically while my mind spun through nightmare scenarios about losing custody. About Fernando living primarily with Regina, learning to see me as the secondary parent or worse, as just a visitor in his life. About years of him growing up calling her mommy while I became just Carla. About her wealth providing material advantages I couldn't match no matter how hard I worked and saved responsibly, trying to build a secure future for us both, despite modest income appropriate for my experience level. In a competitive field where advancement required not just competence, but also visibility and networking opportunities that single mothers had less access to compared to colleagues without childcare responsibilities, limiting after hours participation in professional development activities that I skipped, consistently prioritizing time with Fernando over career advancement that would have required sacrificing precious hours with my son during his formative years when he needed his mother present and engaged. Not working late chasing promotions that would come eventually through merit and patience, rather than through shortcuts requiring neglect of maternal duties. That I refused to consider, regardless of career consequences, after Fernando finally fell asleep clutching his favorite stuffed bear that had accompanied him since infancy, providing comfort through all his developmental stages, including separation anxiety, when he first started daycare, and later when he began staying with Regina 3 times weekly. I sat alone in our modest living room, illuminated only by the soft glow of the table lamp I had bought at a garage sale 3 years ago, refinishing it myself to save money that went instead toward Fernando's needs, and forced myself to watch the video I had recorded that afternoon. Seeing Regina's cruel smile and hearing her chilling words about me losing custody, soon as if it were already decided, rather than just her delusional fantasy that I was determined to prevent from becoming reality, regardless of what it cost me financially to hire an attorney good enough to defeat whatever lies she planned to tell the court about my parenting. The realization that I needed legal representation immediately rather than waiting to see what happened next, because clearly Regina had already retained counsel and filed preliminary paperwork. Based on those attorney documents visible on her coffee table, sent me into research mode, utilizing skills developed through 12 years of financial analysis to thoroughly investigate family law attorneys in our area, reading online reviews, carefully distinguishing between legitimate detailed assessments and generic praise or complaints that could have been fake, checking credentials and success rates in custody cases specifically, because not all attorneys were equally competent in the specialized area of family law that required understanding of complex psychological evaluations, in addition to legal precedents about parental fitness and especially about circumstances warranting removal of child. From fit biological parents' custody to transfer to grandparent, which I knew from my preliminary research was extremely rare, absent serious abuse or neglect, that simply didn't exist in our situation, no matter what lies Regina planned to tell. After 3 hours of intensive research referencing multiple sources, and especially focusing on attorneys who had successfully defended mothers against custody challenges from relatives seeking to exploit minor family conflicts or modest financial limitations as evidence of unfitness when actual parenting quality was consistently appropriate or better. I compiled a short list of 5 attorneys to contact the next morning as soon as their offices opened, barely sleeping that night despite exhaustion from emotional trauma of the day's revelations. Lying awake in my bed listening through the baby monitor to Fernando's peaceful breathing, unaware that his life was about to become a battleground between his mother, fighting desperately to protect him, and his grandmother willing to damage him psychologically through identity confusion and loyalty conflicts, serving her selfish need for control that I was only beginning to understand stemmed from deep psychological issues that I had somehow missed noticing during 37 years as her daughter because I had normalized behaviors that outsiders would recognize immediately as manipulative and controlling. Patterns that would become clearer as I discussed the situation with therapists and attorneys over coming weeks. But in that moment, lying awake at 2 a.m, could only process as incomprehensible betrayal by someone I had trusted absolutely, with my most precious treasure. The morning arrived too slowly and too quickly simultaneously, as I prepared Fernando for school with extra attention to every detail. Knowing that Regina would likely use any minor imperfection as evidence of my inadequate parenting in her custody suit that I still couldn't believe was actually happening, rather than some nightmare I would wake from to find our lives still peacefully normal, with grandmother providing appropriate supplementary care, supporting rather than sabotaging my maternal role. Ensuring Fernando's clothes were perfectly clean and coordinated, his hair neatly brushed, his lunch carefully packed with nutritious options, and a little note telling him I loved him as I did every school day, maintaining our special connection. Even during hours apart when he needed reminders that he was cherished constantly by his mother, who thought about him throughout every workday, looking forward to pickups when I could hear about his day and provide appropriate responses to his endless questions about how things work that I answered patiently, encouraging his natural curiosity, rather than dismissing him as inconvenient when I was tired from working, that I refused to do no matter how exhausted I felt, because childhood was too short to waste opportunities for building strong bonds through present engaged parenting that I was absolutely committed to providing consistently. Throughout his formative years, regardless of personal sacrifices required, after dropping Fernando at school with extra tight hugs that made him ask curiously if something was wrong, prompting me to smile, reassuring him that everything was fine, while internally screaming that nothing was fine, and his grandmother was trying to steal him from me, but I couldn't tell him any of that because he was 5 and deserved to preserve his innocence as long as possible, before adult problems invaded his protected childhood. I drove directly to the office of Dr. Enrique Santos, the family law attorney, whose reviews had been consistently excellent, specifically praising his successful defense of mothers in custody challenges from relatives attempting to exploit minor family conflicts or financial disparities as evidence of parental unfitness when actual caregiving was appropriate. His office located in a modest building, reflecting his focus on serving middle-class clients rather than only wealthy ones who could afford premium locations and corresponding premium fees that would have drained my savings within weeks, was welcoming in a professional way that immediately put me somewhat at ease despite the terrifying circumstances bringing me there so desperately. Dr. Enrique himself, a tan-skinned man in his early 50s with graying hair cut professionally and firm brown eyes that conveyed both competence and compassion, greeted me personally rather than having a secretary do preliminaries, listened attentively as I explained the situation, fighting back tears of rage and fear while showing him the video I had recorded of Regina's cruel words about me losing custody soon, and Fernando calling her mommy, as if it were natural, rather than the result of systematic manipulation that Dr. Enrique recognized immediately as psychological abuse of a minor. Used as instrument in adult conflict, which he assured me judges took very seriously, as evidence of unfitness not of the accused parent, but rather of the accusing relative willing to damage a child psychologically to serve their own needs for control that he had seen in numerous cases over his 25 years practicing family law. His immediate assessment based on the video evidence and my description of my parenting, including stable employment, appropriate housing, documented involvement in Fernando's education and health care, and lack of any history of abuse or neglect, was that Regina's custody suit had virtually no chance of succeeding before a reasonable judge because legal standards for removing a child from a fit biological parent's custody to transfer to a grandparent were extremely high, requiring clear and convincing evidence of serious abuse or neglect that endangered the child's well-being. Standards that simply weren't met by minor financial disparities or subjective disagreements about parenting styles that fell within the broad range of acceptable approaches that courts respected as parental prerogatives. His confidence was simultaneously reassuring and terrifying because it confirmed that Regina's suit was legally groundless, but also meant she was either delusional enough to believe she could win despite lack of valid grounds, or more frighteningly, was willing to put Fernando through traumatic court proceedings and psychological evaluations knowing she would likely lose. Eventually, but calculating that the process itself would damage my relationship with my son through months of uncertainty, and especially through mandatory supervised visitation requirements, judges sometimes imposed pending custody evaluations, even when allegations were unsubstantiated. Dr. Henrique recommended immediate action to protect Fernando, including filing counter motion requesting supervised visitation for Regina. Based on evidence that she had been manipulating Fernando to call her mommy, demonstrating willingness to confuse his maternal attachment, serving her own agenda rather than his psychological well-being, the judges considered strong evidence of unfitness for unsupervised contact, regardless of biological relationship, requesting emergency psychological evaluation for Fernando by court. Appointed child psychologist who could assess and document damage Regina had already caused, teaching him to redirect primary attachment away from me toward herself, creating loyalty conflicts and identity confusion during critical developmental period when secure maternal bonding was essential for healthy emotional development, and especially filing detailed response to Regina's custody petition, including extensive documentation of my appropriate parenting through photographs, demonstrating my consistent involvement in Fernando's activities, medical records showing attendance at all pediatric appointments, with notation of my active participation in healthcare decisions, school records documenting my participation in parent-teacher conferences and classroom volunteer activities when my work schedule permitted, character references from neighbors including Lucia, who had observed my parenting for years living in the adjacent apartment and could testify about witnessing consistently appropriate care, and especially about my obvious loving bond with Fernando, evident through daily interactions she observed when we encountered each other in the hallway or courtyard, and sworn affidavit from Marcos attesting to my exemplary co-parenting throughout Fernando's life, including my encouragement of his relationship with his father, despite our divorce, rather than attempting to alienate him through bad-mouthing or scheduling conflicts that some divorced parents used to interfere with ex-spouse's visitation that I had never done because Fernando deserved positive relationships with both parents, the cost estimate Dr. Henrique provided for legal representation through the custody proceedings that would likely last 6 months to a year depending on court schedules and complexity of psychological evaluations, was substantial at $15,000 total, requiring $5,000 retainer immediately with remaining balance paid in installments over coming months. An amount that would drain my modest savings accumulated carefully over years of disciplined budgeting, prioritizing security over luxuries, but that I didn't hesitate committing because protecting Fernando was worth any financial sacrifice, regardless of how long it took to rebuild that emergency fund that I had intended eventually to use as down payment on a small house providing Fernando with a yard to play in and a sense of permanence that renting couldn't offer, but that dream could wait while I fought to maintain custody of my son, who was infinitely more important than real estate aspirations or any other material goals. Signing the retainer agreement and writing a check that represented months of careful saving felt simultaneously devastating and empowering, because I was taking concrete action to protect Fernando from Regina's manipulations, rather than remaining passive victim of her assault on our family bond that I refused to surrender without fighting with every resource available, including financial resources I had preserved. Through years of modest living precisely for emergencies like this, though, I never imagined the emergency would be my own mother trying to steal my child, leaving Dr. Henrique's office with instructions to document everything going forward, including maintaining daily journal of Fernando's behaviors and statements that might reflect Regina's manipulations, collecting all receipts and records demonstrating financial responsibility in providing for his needs despite modest income, and especially avoiding any direct confrontation with Regina that she could characterize as unstable behavior supporting her allegations of my unfitness that I knew would be lies, but that I had to counter through exemplary conduct, documented meticulously, proving my consistent, appropriate parenting, despite the extreme stress of facing custody challenge that would have broken many parents, but that I was determined to survive intact with my son still in my arms where he belonged. Driving to work from Dr. Henrique's office, I realized I needed to inform my supervisor about the custody situation, requiring me to attend multiple court appearances and attorney meetings over coming months, Camila, who supervised our analytics department, was a 45-year-old woman who had always been supportive of work-life balance issues, including accommodating my need to leave promptly at 5:30 every workday to pick up Fernando from after-school program. Her reaction to my explanation of Regina's custody challenge was immediate outrage on my behalf, having observed my dedication to Fernando through years of working together, noting how I never missed work for trivial reasons, but never hesitated taking time off when Fernando was sick, requiring maternal care that I prioritized appropriately over professional obligations that could be managed through careful planning and efficient work habits. Ensuring my output remained consistently high, despite reduced hours compared to childless colleagues who could stay late working on complex analyses that I completed during regular business hours through focused concentration, eliminating social distractions that others indulged in. Camila immediately assured me that she would accommodate any schedule adjustments needed for legal appointments and court dates, strongly recommending I take advantage of the company's Employee Assistance Program, providing short-term counseling services for employees dealing with family crises that I hadn't even known existed, until she mentioned it, suggesting I call them immediately. To arrange sessions with therapists who could help me process the complex emotions about Regina's betrayal, and especially about the fear of losing Fernando, that was consuming my mental energy, affecting my ability to focus on work tasks requiring concentration that I normally handled easily, but now found challenging when intrusive thoughts about custody proceedings kept interrupting analytical thinking. Following Camila's advice, I contacted the EAP hotline during my lunch break, speaking with counselor who arranged appointment for that same evening with Dr. Beatriz Almeida, a therapist specializing in family trauma, and especially in recovery from relational betrayals by trusted family members whose devastating impact often exceeded betrayals by friends or partners, because family relationships were supposed to be unconditionally secure, creating foundations of psychological safety that, when violated through calculated manipulations, caused deeper wounds requiring specialized treatment, addressing both immediate crisis management and long-term healing from broken fundamental assumptions about family loyalty that I had believed were absolute until Regina shattered that naive trust through her custody suit, targeting my most precious relationship. The first therapy session that evening after picking up Fernando from after-school program and arranging for Adriana, my closest friend since college, who is also a single mother of 2 daughters, to watch him at her apartment, giving me privacy for the emotional processing I needed to do, without Fernando overhearing discussions about his grandmother's betrayal that he was too young to understand appropriately, especially given that Regina had already confused his understanding of family roles, teaching him to call her mommy, creating loyalty conflicts that therapy would need to address. Began with Dr. Beatrice asking me to tell my story from the beginning, starting with my relationship history with Regina, before the betrayal that I had always characterized as close and supportive, but that Dr. Beatrice immediately began questioning whether patterns of manipulation and control had existed throughout my life, normalized through gradual acclimation starting in childhood, when I had no framework for recognizing unhealthy dynamics that seemed normal, because they were all I knew growing up in Regina's household, where she had always been subtly controlling about decisions from my choice of college major that she had strongly influenced toward practical fields like business, instead of my interest in art that she dismissed as financially irresponsible toward my relationships that she criticized based on her preferences rather than supporting my choices as autonomous adult toward even minor decisions about clothing or hairstyles that she offered opinions about couched as helpful suggestions, but delivered with undertone implying my choices were somehow inadequate compared to her superior judgment about appropriate presentation and behavior that I had internalized as just her personality, rather than recognizing as systematic undermining of my confidence and autonomy, that explained partially why she now felt entitled to challenge my custody, believing she knew better than me how Fernando should be raised despite him being my son, not hers. Unpacking 37 years of mother-daughter dynamics in 50-minute therapy sessions was obviously impossible, but Dr. Beatrice helped me begin recognizing patterns that I needed to examine more thoroughly over time to prevent repeating cycles of control and manipulation in my own parenting of Fernando, who deserved better than unconsciously inheriting dysfunctional relationship patterns that I had experienced as normal during my childhood. The most immediate therapeutic work, however, focused on managing acute anxiety about custody proceedings, affecting my sleep quality, and consequently my ability to function optimally at work, and especially at home, where Fernando needed me present and emotionally stable, rather than consumed by fear and rage about Regina's betrayal that Dr. Beatrice taught me to process through cognitive techniques, identifying irrational thoughts, catastrophizing about definitely losing custody, when Dr. Henrique had assured me the legal grounds for Regina's suit were virtually non-existent, and replacing those catastrophic thoughts with more realistic assessments based on objective evidence about my exemplary parenting that multiple professionals could testify to if necessary. Breathing exercises for managing panic attacks that started happening unexpectedly when intrusive thoughts about losing Fernando would flood my system with adrenaline-causing physical symptoms, including racing heart and dizziness that I initially feared were cardiac problems requiring medical attention, but that Dr. Beatrice identified immediately as anxiety manifestations, requiring psychological intervention rather than medical treatment, though she recommended I schedule physical exam to rule out underlying health issues that stress could exacerbate, especially given that I had been neglecting basic self-care, including inconsistent eating and disrupted sleep since discovering Regina's betrayal 3 days earlier, though it felt simultaneously like it had happened yesterday and months ago depending on my emotional state at any given moment, and especially validation that my rage about Regina's betrayal was appropriate. Rather than excessive as I had feared, worrying that anger this intense might indicate I was unstable, potentially giving credence to whatever lies Regina planned to tell about my unfitness when Dr. Beatrice assured me that anyone would feel furious about their mother trying to steal their child, and that acknowledging anger was healthy compared to suppression that would manifest eventually through depression or physical symptoms that could actually interfere with my functioning more than appropriately expressed anger, channeled constructively through legal responses, rather than destructive confrontations that Regina could use against me. Over the following weeks, as Dr. Henrique prepared our response to Regina's custody petition, while Dr. Beatrice helped me maintain psychological stability, despite overwhelming stress of facing potential loss of my son, to the woman who had birthed and supposedly loved me, but was now demonstrating that whatever love she claimed had always been conditional on my compliance with her expectations that I apparently violated through autonomous parenting decisions she disagreed with, though I still couldn't identify what specific decisions had triggered this extreme response, unless it was simply that I existed as independent adult outside her control that threatened her need for dominance in all relationships. I maintained daily routines with Fernando, documenting everything meticulously as Dr. Enrique instructed, including photographing his meals, demonstrating adequate nutrition despite modest food budget, saving all receipts from necessary purchases including school supplies, clothing, and enrichment activities like library visits and free community events that I substituted for expensive entertainment options that wealthy families could afford, but that weren't necessary for happy, healthy childhood, requiring primarily parental time and attention that I provided abundantly, despite working full time, unlike Regina, who despite her wealth had worked long hours during my childhood, frequently leaving me with babysitters whose faces I barely remembered, compared to vivid memories of time with my father before his death when I was 12, leaving Regina as sole parent during my teenage years, when our relationship became increasingly strained through conflicts about autonomy and control that I had attributed to normal adolescent development, but that Dr. Beatrice suggested reflected escalation of Regina's controlling tendencies when my father's tempering influence disappeared, allowing her more extreme behaviors to emerge unchecked by partner who apparently had balanced her tendencies toward excessive control during their marriage before his death from heart attack that devastated us both. Though we processed grief differently, with Regina becoming even more controlling perhaps as response to loss of control over his death, while I became more independent, seeking autonomy that threatened her need for control, creating foundational conflict that lay dormant during my adult years, as long as I maintained surface compliance with her expectations, but erupted when she decided my parenting wasn't meeting her standards, warranting intervention through custody suit that she apparently believed was justified by financial disparities, and possibly by my divorce from Marcos that she had initially supported, but perhaps secretly viewed as failure, reflecting on her parenting of me, creating need to prove her superiority by raising Fernando herself to perfect outcome that she believed I was incapable of achieving, despite all evidence to contrary documented thoroughly through years of responsible parenting. The court ordered psychological evaluation of Fernando conducted by Dr. Patricia Suarez, a child psychologist specializing in custody cases, who spent 5 sessions with him over 2 weeks observing his behaviors and especially assessing his attachment patterns to determine whether Regina's manipulation had caused significant damage requiring intervention, or whether he remained primarily bonded to me, despite confusion she had deliberately created teaching him to call her mommy. was the most terrifying 2 weeks of my life, waiting for results that would influence the judge's decision about custody arrangements pending final resolution of Regina's suit that Dr. Henrique expected would take at least 6 months, possibly up to a year, depending on court schedules and whether Regina continued fighting despite weak legal grounds or accepted defeat gracefully, which he doubted given the extreme lengths she had already gone to, challenging my custody, indicating personality unable to accept loss of control gracefully. Dr. Uridiai. Patricia's report, when finally delivered to both attorneys and the court, concluded that Fernando, while showing some confusion about family roles that she attributed directly to Regina's inappropriate teaching of alternative maternal identity, remained primarily attached to me, demonstrating secure maternal bonding through all standard assessment measures, including separation anxiety, appropriate for his developmental age when separated from me, but inappropriate absence when separated from Regina, indicating I was his primary attachment figure, despite her attempts to supplant that role through months of manipulation that fortunately hadn't succeeded in destroying our fundamental mother. Son bond, though, had created confusion, requiring therapeutic intervention to clarify appropriate family relationships, before confusion crystallized into permanent misconceptions about maternal identity that could cause psychological damage through adolescence and adulthood, affecting his ability to form healthy attachments in future relationships if not corrected immediately through therapy, addressing specific misconceptions Regina had implanted systematically. Dr. Patricia's strong recommendation that Fernando begin weekly therapy sessions with her specifically addressing family role confusion, and especially that Regina's unsupervised contact be suspended immediately pending completion of her own psychological evaluation, assessing her fitness for any contact with Fernando, given her demonstrated willingness to manipulate him psychologically, serving her own needs regardless of damage to him, was exactly the professional validation I needed to counter Regina's allegations about my unfitness that suddenly looked extremely hypocritical, given that the actual documented psychological abuse was being perpetrated by her, not me, as she had accused through custody suit, claiming I was negligent and unstable, when reality confirmed by objective professional assessment was that I was competent, loving mother, providing appropriate care, while Regina was willing to damage her grandson psychologically to satisfy her own control needs that Dr. Patricia characterized in her report as concerning, possibly indicating personality disorder, requiring evaluation before any contact with Fernando could be considered appropriate, given risks of continued manipulation that could cause escalating psychological damage during his formative developmental period when intervention was most effective. But delays in treatment could result in trauma requiring years of therapy to resolve, if addressed at all, given that some identity confusion implanted during critical early childhood periods became permanent features of self concept resistant to later therapeutic intervention, armed with Dr. Patricia's damning assessment of Regina's behavior and strong recommendation for supervised contact, only pending her own psychological evaluation, that would likely reveal personality pathology explaining her willingness to harm her grandson serving selfish needs. Dr. Henrique filed emergency motion requesting immediate modification of custody arrangements, suspending Regina's unsupervised access to Fernando until completion of her evaluation, and especially requesting court order, mandating her compliance with evaluation, given that she could simply refuse participating if it remained optional rather than court-ordered requirement for maintaining any contact with Fernando. The emergency hearing, scheduled 3 weeks after filing, was my first direct confrontation with Regina since that devastating afternoon when I discovered her betrayal, seeing her across the courtroom accompanied by her attorney, a distinguished-looking older man whose expensive suit contrasted sharply with Dr. Henrique's modest professional attire, reflecting differences in their clientele, but not necessarily in their competence, that I reminded myself repeatedly when anxiety about her superior financial resources threatened to overwhelm my confidence that justice would prevail based on objective evidence rather than on wealth disparities. Her cold stare, conveying rage about being challenged rather than guilt about her manipulative behavior, confirmed that she genuinely believed she was entitled to custody of Fernando, despite him being my son, and despite her lack of valid legal grounds because her narcissistic personality that I was only beginning to recognize clearly through therapy with Dr. Beatrice couldn't accept that I had rights superseding her preferences about his upbringing, that she believed her age and financial resources entitled her to control, regardless of legal and ethical standards protecting parental rights from interference by relatives disagreeing with parenting styles that fell within broad range of acceptable approaches. The judge, a woman in her 50s named Judge Morrison, who had reputation according to Dr. Henrique for no nonsense approach to custody cases focusing on children's well-being, rather than adults' preferences or egos that often drove family court litigation, causing unnecessary trauma to children caught between warring relatives, more interested in winning battles than protecting kids from psychological damage caused by prolonged legal conflicts, reviewed Dr. Patricia's report carefully before questioning both attorneys about their positions on appropriate temporary arrangements pending full custody evaluation. Regina's attorney argued weakly that supervised visitation was excessive response to minor confusion about family roles that he characterized as innocent misunderstanding rather than deliberate manipulation that Dr. Patricia's report clearly documented through detailed analysis of Fernando's statements during evaluation sessions, revealing systematic teaching of alternative maternal identity that couldn't have occurred accidentally through innocent play, but required deliberate, repetitive instruction over extended period that Regina would have had to implement consciously, not inadvertently. Judge Morrison's skeptical expression during his argument suggested she wasn't buying his characterization of deliberate manipulation as innocent misunderstanding. Her questions focused appropriately on whether Fernando's well-being was better served by maintaining contact with grandmother who had demonstrated willingness to confuse his identity, serving her own agenda, or by suspending contact until comprehensive evaluation could determine whether she posed ongoing psychological risk to his healthy development, that courts had obligation to protect against, regardless of biological relationships, when relatives demonstrated unfitness for unsupervised contact through behaviors documented professionally as harmful to children's well-being. Dr. Henrique's argument that supervised visitation was minimum appropriate protection for Fernando, given documented evidence of psychological manipulation pending evaluation of Regina's fitness for any contact, was delivered calmly and supported by Dr. Patricia's detailed report, making Judge Morrison's decision straightforward when she ruled from the bench immediately rather than taking matter under advisement as she could have done that Regina's contact with Fernando would be limited to 2 hours weekly, supervised by court-appointed monitor at neutral location, pending completion of psychological evaluation by court. Appointed evaluator rather than by professional, she could hire to provide favorable assessment that wouldn't be objective given financial relationship creating bias toward conclusions, serving client who paid for evaluation rather than serving truth about her fitness. Regina's face when Judge Morrison delivered that ruling showed rage rather than the appropriate concern about her grandson's well-being that a loving grandmother would have displayed if genuinely motivated by his best interests rather than by selfish control needs that her reaction confirmed clearly for anyone paying attention, including Judge Morrison, whose expression suggested she had seen this pattern many times in family court cases where relatives claimed to be protecting children, but actually were seeking control serving their own psychological needs rather than kids' actual well-being. The relief flooding through me when Judge Morrison's ruling confirmed that Fernando would be protected from unsupervised manipulation was so intense I nearly collapsed in the courtroom, Dr. Henrique catching my elbow, steadying me while Regina stormed out. Without acknowledging my presence or showing any concern about Fernando, who she claimed to love enough to deserve custody, but apparently didn't love enough to accept judicial decision, protecting him from her manipulations that she should have recognized as harmful if she were actually capable of prioritizing his well-being over her need for control, that her behavior consistently demonstrated was her actual motivation rather than his best interests, that she claimed to be serving through custody suit, that now was clearly failing before objective judicial scrutiny. Over the following 3 months, while Regina underwent court-ordered psychological evaluation and Fernando attended weekly therapy sessions with Dr. Patricia, processing confusion about family roles and especially relearning appropriate identification of me as his mommy, not Regina, who was grandmother serving supportive supplementary role rather than primary maternal role she had tried to usurp through manipulations that therapy was systematically correcting through age. Appropriate discussions about family structures, and especially about the fact that having multiple caring adults in his life didn't require confusion about who his actual mother was, compared to other relatives who loved him differently, but not in the maternal role reserved exclusively for me. I focused on maintaining stability in our daily routines, ensuring Fernando felt secure despite the upheaval in our family relationships, including loss of unsupervised contact with Regina, that he initially missed asking repeatedly when he could visit her house, the way he used to before supervised visitations at neutral location with monitor present, eliminated the comfortable familiarity of her home, and especially eliminated her ability to continue manipulations that had made him feel special through inappropriate elevation to quasi-son status that felt exciting to 5-year-old, unable to understand psychological implications of identity confusion. She was creating deliberately. Dr. Patricia helped him process those feelings, validating that missing grandmother was normal while clarifying that new arrangements were protecting him from confusing messages about family relationships that had been making him feel mixed up about who was who in his family structure that needed clarity, appropriate for his developmental stage, rather than ambiguity. Serving adult agendas that he couldn't understand appropriately given his age, and cognitive limitations that Regina had exploited manipulatively, teaching him concepts about multiple mommies that weren't appropriate or accurate, but served her need to position herself as maternal equivalent, rather than as grandmother supporting my maternal role appropriately. The psychological evaluation report on Regina completed by court-appointed evaluator Dr. Rafael Mendez after 8 sessions. Over 10 weeks period, including comprehensive testing, using standardized instruments assessing personality functioning and especially fitness for contact with minor children in her care, concluded that Regina demonstrated narcissistic personality traits including grandiose sense of entitlement to control others' decisions, lack of empathy for others' feelings when they conflicted with her preferences, willingness to manipulate others including vulnerable children to achieve her goals, and especially inability to accept appropriate boundaries on her authority over family members who were autonomous adults making independent decisions about their own lives, and especially about their own children that she believed she had right to override through any means necessary, including psychologically manipulative tactics, targeting vulnerable children too young to resist her influence that she exploited, systematically teaching Fernando to call her mommy, deliberately creating identity confusion, serving her agenda to position herself as maternal equivalent rather than as grandmother, appropriately supporting my maternal authority that should have been inviolable, but that she violated systematically. During months of unsupervised access that she had abused, betraying trust, I had extended believing she would respect appropriate boundaries between grandmother and mother roles that she apparently never accepted as legitimate, given her narcissistic belief that her preferences superseded my parental rights, simply because she disagreed with my parenting decisions that fell well within range of acceptable approaches, but didn't match her specific standards that she believed everyone should follow regardless of their rights as autonomous adults making independent choices. Dr. Mendez's recommendation that Regina's contact with Fernando remain supervised indefinitely unless she completed extensive therapy addressing narcissistic traits and especially addressing her boundary violations and manipulative behaviors that demonstrated unfitness for unsupervised contact with vulnerable minor, who she had already harmed psychologically through deliberate identity confusion, requiring therapeutic intervention to correct, was exactly the professional validation I needed to protect Fernando permanently from her manipulations, while Judge Morrison, who received Dr. Mendez's report, along with updated assessment from Dr. Patricia documenting Fernando's progress in therapy, but noting that continued supervised contact with Regina remained necessary to prevent regression to previous confusion about maternal identity that could be triggered by her renewed access to manipulate him without monitoring, preventing inappropriate messages about family roles that he was finally beginning to understand clearly after months of therapeutic work correcting misconceptions she had implanted systematically. Issued final ruling 6 months after emergency hearing establishing permanent custody arrangements, confirming that I retained full custody of Fernando, with Regina limited to supervised visitation 2 hours monthly rather than weekly, that she had been granted initially during evaluation period, that Judge Morrison reduced based on Dr. Mendez's assessment that Regina hadn't demonstrated understanding of her inappropriate behaviors or willingness to change patterns of manipulation that posed ongoing risk to Fernando's psychological well-being if contact remained more frequent than monthly schedule, allowing him maximum time to consolidate healthy identity without constant interference from grandmother, unable to respect appropriate boundaries even when court ordered that she had violated repeatedly during supervised visitations according to monitor reports documenting her attempts to undermine my parental authority through subtle comments about my decisions that monitor had to intervene, stopping repeatedly reminding Regina that criticizing my parenting during visits with Fernando was inappropriate and specifically prohibited under supervision agreement that she signed, agreeing to comply with, but apparently couldn't follow consistently given her compulsive need to control situations that her narcissistic personality made intolerable when others made decisions she disagreed with regardless of their legal authority to make those decisions independently. Signed, agreeing to comply with, but apparently couldn't follow consistently, given her compulsive need to control situations that her narcissistic personality made intolerable when others made decisions she disagreed with regardless of their legal authority to make those decisions independently. The finality of Judge Morrison's ruling after 6 months of legal battles costing me the entire $15,000 plus additional $3,000 for expert testimony that became necessary when Regina continued fighting, despite weak legal grounds requiring Dr. Patricia and Dr. Mendez to testify in court about their professional assessments documenting her unfitness for unsupervised contact and my competent, appropriate parenting that Regina's attorney had tried unsuccessfully to undermine through character assassination, attempting to portray my modest income as evidence of inability to provide adequately for Fernando, when evidence clearly showed I provided appropriate care on reasonable budget, prioritizing his needs consistently. Brought simultaneous relief that Fernando was protected permanently from her manipulations and grief about permanent loss of maternal relationship that had been important throughout my life, despite its dysfunctional aspects that I was only recognizing clearly through therapy with Dr. Beatrice, examining patterns of control and manipulation that had characterized our relationship since my childhood, but that I had normalized through gradual acclimation, making me unable to recognize abusive dynamics until they escalated to this extreme custody battle, revealing Regina's character clearly through her willingness to harm her grandson, psychologically serving her selfish need for control that I could no longer minimize or excuse as just her personality or her way of showing love, when it clearly wasn't love but rather narcissistic need for dominance over everyone in her orbit, including innocent children she would damage pursuing that dominance. The meticulous documentation I had maintained, obsessively recording all significant parental decisions, including pediatric consultations with detailed notes about discussions with doctors, school meetings documenting Fernando's educational and social progress, extracurricular activities with photographs demonstrating active participation in developing his interests and abilities, and especially structured daily routines ensuring adequate nutrition, sufficient sleep, appropriate hygiene, and intellectual stimulation through regular reading and enriching educational conversations, was instrumental during legal proceedings, providing concrete, irrefutable evidence about my unquestionable maternal competence that Regina had tried to distort cruelly through. That biased dossier compiled selectively, including only negative, distorted aspects, while conveniently omitting the much more positive reality about dedicated mothering executed consistently during 5 years, building strong maternal bond founded on unconditional love and constant presence that no superior financial resources could legitimately replicate, regardless of motivations alleged by grandmother attempting to usurp custody through systematic manipulation, psychologically harming innocent child. The careful planning for future, including establishment of educational fund for Fernando, guaranteeing access to university opportunities regardless of current financial limitations, through modest but consistent monthly contributions accumulating gradually during remaining years before he reached appropriate age for higher education. Maximization of benefits available through government programs designed to support single parent families, including tax credits and educational subsidies that I researched meticulously, ensuring complete utilization of public resources legitimately available, and especially continued professional career development, seeking additional promotions, increasing income, eventually allowing move to larger apartment, providing more space for Fernando to grow comfortably, demonstrated unquestionable commitment to his long-term well-being that Regina had tried to characterize distortedly as negligence based on unfair comparisons with her substantially superior financial resources, accumulated during decades of successful professional career, and especially family inheritance that I obviously didn't possess yet as a 37-year-old woman, building wealth gradually through honest work rather than inherited advantages, the individual therapy I initiated parallel to Fernando's child therapy with Dr. Beatrice, specializing in relational trauma, and especially in reconstruction after devastating family betrayals, was fundamental resource for processing complex emotions about the situation, including justified anger about cruel manipulations executed by Regina, profound sadness about loss of maternal relationship that had been important during 3 decades before that revealing betrayal, irrational guilt, questioning whether I had somehow failed provoking that extreme reaction from her that therapy helped me recognize as inappropriate projection of, responsibility that belonged exclusively to Regina for conscious choices she made, prioritizing egocentric needs over her grandson's well-being, and especially over preservation of relationship with daughter. She destroyed irreversibly through those calculated actions, motivated by complex psychological reasons I was gradually learning to understand without necessarily forgiving, considering magnitude of damages caused to both me and especially to Fernando during months of systematic manipulation, confusing maternal identity through deliberate teaching about multiple mommies, the conscious decision not to allow negative experience with Regina to contaminate ability to trust again in family relationships or close friendships, required considerable therapeutic work resisting temptation. To generalize individual betrayal into universal pattern where all close people were potential threats disguised, waiting for opportunities to betray trust, when more balanced reality recognized that Regina represented exception rather than rule, and that most people, including Adriana, Lucia, Dr. Henrique, and various professionals who supported me during that crisis, consistently demonstrated genuine integrity, deserving appropriate trust, while maintaining simultaneously healthy vigilance, protecting against future vulnerabilities, without allowing paranoia to replace capacity to form authentic human connections, fundamental to emotional well-being, both mine and especially Fernando's, who needed to observe appropriate modeling of healthy relationships based on mutual respect and, especially on clear boundaries respected consistently by everyone involved, guaranteeing psychological security necessary for healthy emotional development during formative childhood years. Honest reflection on my own childhood as Regina's daughter revealed concerning patterns I had inappropriately normalized, including excessive control over personal decisions she justified as maternal protection, when reality represented systematic manipulation limiting autonomy through subtle criticism of choices diverging from her preferences. Constant interference in romantic relationships she disapproved of based on arbitrary criteria about appropriate partners, reflecting her values rather than respecting my legitimate preferences as independent adult, and especially implicit expectations about perpetual gratitude for sacrifices she made during my childhood, as if motherhood were investment demanding continuous returns instead of responsibility voluntarily chosen when deciding to have children, assuming inherent obligations to that decision, including provision of appropriate care without expectations of future compensation, transforming parental relationship into financial transaction, instead of emotional bond founded on unconditional love, offered freely without conditions or later charges that she now was manifesting through that custody attempt, as if Fernando were disputable property instead of individual human being with his own rights deserving protection against harmful manipulations executed by adults prioritizing egocentric needs. Renewed daily commitment to being different mother for Fernando, breaking dysfunctional cycles of excessive control and emotional manipulation I had experienced during own childhood with Regina included conscious respect for his growing autonomy, appropriate for each developmental stage, allowing genuine choices about aspects of his life while providing loving guidance and safe boundaries necessary for healthy navigation of childhood challenges. Open communication encouraging honest expression of feelings, including negative emotions like anger or frustration, that were appropriately validated instead of suppressed through shame or punishment, as Regina frequently did with me during childhood. Generating emotional repression patterns taking years, deconstructing through adult therapy, and especially consistent modeling of healthy relationships based on mutual respect and especially on capacity to genuinely acknowledge mistakes, appropriately apologizing when warranted, instead of maintaining facade of parental infallibility that Regina always projected, refusing to admit failures even when evidence was irrefutable, demonstrating she had caused harm through inappropriate choices, prioritizing her own needs. Profound gratitude for professionals who supported me during that devastating crisis, including Dr. Henrique providing competent legal defense protecting maternal rights through sophisticated legal argumentation founded on relevant precedents, and especially on concrete evidence about unquestionable parental competence. Dr. Patricia offering specialized child therapy repairing psychological confusion implanted in Fernando during months of systematic manipulation. Dr. Beatrice facilitating processing of relational trauma, allowing emotional reconstruction after devastating family betrayal. Supervisor Camila monitoring visitations, ensuring Regina's compliance with judicially established limits, protecting Fernando from additional manipulations, and especially friend Adriana providing unconditional emotional support during darkest moments when I doubted capacity to overcome adversity so extreme, threatening most important relationship of my life. Reinforced conviction about fundamental importance of building support networks, composed of competent and especially principled individuals, sharing values about protecting vulnerable children against manipulative adults, prioritizing egocentric needs over minors' well-being depending on protection instead of exploitation through inappropriate appropriations of family roles legitimately belonging to other people. Most valuable lesson I extracted from that devastating experience, transcending immediate pain about family betrayal, was recognition that competent mothering doesn't require impossible perfection or unlimited financial resources, but rather genuine dedication to child's physical and emotional well-being through consistent presence, unconditional love, and especially vigilant protection against threats, including those surprisingly originating from own family members who should be supporting instead of sabotaging through calculated manipulations motivated by egocentric needs, inadequately disguised as legitimate concerns about child welfare, when underlying reality was pathological desire for control and power. Over situations, manipulative adults perceived threatening their emotional security instead of genuinely focusing on children's best interests, who are innocently used as instruments in conflicts they never asked to participate in, inevitably causing lasting trauma, regardless of how carefully adults try minimizing direct exposure to devastating details constantly discussed in formal legal contexts, evaluating parental competencies through invasive clinical methodologies. Renewed hope about future founded on recognition that Fernando and I had survived, and especially were thriving after judicial storm establishing new normal more conscious about importance of appropriate family boundaries, provided daily motivation to continue building worthy life. Through dedicated work, responsible mothering, and especially through cultivating genuine relationships with people consistently demonstrating integrity, deserving appropriate trust, allowing me finally to begin processing emotions about loss of relationship with Regina without bitterness consuming energy necessary for focusing on true priorities, including Fernando's healthy development, and especially my own emotional well-being that I had neglected during months focusing exclusively on survival during crisis, but now needed restoring through appropriate self-care, including pleasurable activities, enriching social connections, and especially through gradual forgiveness, not necessarily of Regina, whose actions remained unforgivable considering magnitude of betrayal. Executed calculatedly, but especially of myself for moments of irrational doubt, questioning maternal adequacy, when objective reality confirmed by multiple professionals and especially by formal judicial decision was that I had always been and continued being excellent mother, providing exactly the care Fernando needed to thrive, developing healthily toward promising future founded on solid emotional base, established during formative childhood years, lovingly protected against all adversities, including those tragically originating from within own family. Did you enjoy Carla's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you right here on the screen. Click there, and I'll be waiting for you.